Okay, so good afternoon, students. Let us continue with our classes on post-colonial literature. Today, we take a look at the work of a major writer in this paper, one who is different from others prescribed in this paper. Before I start the presentation, let me ask you a question in the form of a quiz regarding this. The writer whose work we're going to discuss now is Leopold Senghor. In what way is Senghor different from the other writers we discuss in the post-colonial literature's paper? I'll just mention a few writers, some of the writers that we have already discussed, like A.K. Ramanujan, Alan Carnot. There are others that we will be discussing soon. Chinua Achebe, for example. Other teachers will be discussing Wole Soyinka, Margaret Atwood, many of those writers. In what way is Leopold Senghor different from these writers? Anyone?
Ma'am, I think the rest of them look after for their native
Name.
importance.
Okay.
I don't know whether it is right.
No, therefore, what about Senghor? What is it that you're trying to say
He
about?
might be different because in the case of KB and also in Soinka, they gave more importance to their native writings and native language settlers.
You mean the revival of the
Yes,
African
yes,
culture and tradition
yes.
and so on? That is there in Senghor also. You can't consider Senghor as much of an exception there. It's
Okay.
another major difference. I think I had briefly made a mention of this one word that I'm looking for in one of the previous classes. I had explained it. I think in some context I had spent 1 or 2 minutes to talk about that. Okay, I will start the presentation and if you can think of the answer, you can give me the answer. Maybe when you see the presentation, you will get a better idea. Yeah, so this is the poet Leopold Senghor, and the poem that we have to discuss is New York. I hope the presentation is clear.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes,
Yeah,
ma'am.
okay, fine. Yeah, this picture will definitely not give you any clue or indication about the difference, but something in it may probably enable you to, I think, point the difference. Do you see the stamp there?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, something in it will give you a clue. Okay, so the answer is here. I won't show you the bottom part of the slide. When you look at this map, maybe you could tell me the answer. It is clear in this.
Ma'am, African nationalism. My
African nationalism. Okay, in what way? I mean, is it only
mm,
Africa that you see there? Uh,
no, ma'am. The
yeah.
people who share the same culture, African tradition, something you said.
Yeah, I mean, he's an African writer, of course, but he's not the only African writer. I already mentioned Chinua Achebe. So there are other African writers too. But there is something that separates him from the others, which is clearly indicated in this map. Try to crack the code. The colored areas in the world map here, of course, are the former colonies. All of them were at one point or or the other colonies. They are not the only colonies in the world. There have been other countries too. In Africa itself, for example, you see Congo there marked in gray. It was a colony, but it was a colony of Belgium. And that's why it's not marked here. Okay, so the answer is the fact that Leopold Senghor is a francophone writer, unlike the other writers whom we discuss in this paper. The difference is that Senegal, like a few other countries marked in this map, was a colony of the French. The maroon or the red colonies marked here, including India, Australia, Canada, and all those other African countries, Nigeria included, actually is of course from Nigeria, as is Wole Soyinka. They were all British colonies, and that is why English became the language that these writers adopted after the period of colonization, and that's why you call them the Anglophone colonies. I think I had explained this term, Anglophone, Francophone, Lusophone, and so on. Lusophone referring to the colonies of Portugal. That's not, of course, marked in this map. Here we are looking at the difference between the Anglophone colonies and the Francophone colonies. So in the Francophone colonies, most of them are, of course, in Africa. A few other regions scattered over the rest of the world. One particular country that you need to notice is in the continent of South America. You have a tiny blue country there that is French Guiana. Even today, actually, French Guiana is under the no, that is Suriname, I think. Suriname, yeah. There is one more country which is French Guiana. Even today, it is under the control of the French. And that is why when people say, which is the country, the biggest country that borders France, we should not be looking for, France is here. We should not be looking for countries like Germany here or Spain that border, French as the biggest countries. This is, you have this tiny country of French Guiana somewhere here, and the rest of it is the country of Brazil. And Brazil is therefore the biggest country bordering France. Anyway, that is beside the point. We are looking at the Francophone colonies, and that is a very important point. We cannot discuss Leopold Senghor without talking about the time that he spent in Paris. Like many other young students or young people of his generation, after their elementary education in the schools set up in the country by the French colonial establishment, many of them would migrate to other countries. People of Nigeria would migrate to either England or to the United States after their education, because they would have been taught in an English medium school. Whereas in countries like Senegal and Martinique and Madagascar, then all the other Francophone French colonies, the basic education would have been in French, and therefore it was to Paris or other cities of France that they went for their further education. And that is why, the fact that they are Francophone writers is very significant, because when people like Senghor, met as students in the different universities of Paris, of France, you have something major evolving there. And that is what is known as the negritude movement. We cannot discuss the poetry of Senghor without talking about this very important concept in post-colonial studies, negritude. I think I have given negritude as the topic for one of you for the audit course. We'll look forward to that. I hope that person has already done some work on the negritude movement. Senghor was, he is of course today recognized as a major poet, major post-colonial poet, one of the chief proponents of the negritude movement, which we will be discussing soon. But he's much more than that. As a person, as a student in Paris, he was, he was educated in some of the best institutions in Paris, and there he was also very closely linked with various political movements. And his involvement with politics began early, and he played a key role in the country of Senegal becoming independent in the year 1960, which is why he was, without any controversy, unanimously elected as the first president of this country, of the country of Senegal. So here you have a statesman, a writer, a poet, a thinker, a critic, a theoretician, a person of many parts, Leopold Sedar Senghor, who lived from 1906 to 2001, a poet, leader, and cultural theorist, who became the first elected president of Senegal and continued in that office, for a very, very long period of time. I think for more than 20 years, he was actually in power there. And it was only when he stepped down, he chose to step down, that the country had another president. That was the kind of influence he had in Senegal, a very popular, much loved, and very much respected leader and statesman, and beyond all that, a great writer too. So I cannot conceive of a paper on post-colonial literature without the mention of, or without a work by Leopold Senghor in it, which is why we need to discuss this work called New York. Yeah, so Senghor as a poet has, even if you do not take into consideration his work as a negritude theoretician, his work as a statesman or as a politician, he would still be reckoned as a great person, because he had achieved much as a poet, as the names of these volumes will indicate. They were all, of course, written in French, because French was the language in which he naturally could express himself. But because of his stature, all these works were translated into English by others, and you have the names of those works: Songs of Shadow, Black Offerings, Ethiopiques, Nocturnes, Major Elegies, and so on. It is from the collection Ethiopiques in the 1956 collection, Ethiopiques, that the poem New York is taken. And he was also inducted into the French Academy in 1984. Well, he was actually the first African member in the very prestigious organization called the French Academy. It's something that is very, very elite, and therefore even to get admitted as a member was a mighty thing, and he was the first African to be elected to the French Academy. Yeah, and you cannot separate his political and literary careers. What he espoused as a politician can be seen very clearly enunciated in his writings, both in his poetry and in his many prose writings. He, as a student, he of course spent a great deal of time in France. But even after, he moved to Senegal after his education, he maintained very close links with France, and he was actually involved in French politics too. He was very much involved in the world wars and so on. And his works were naturally in French. He wrote poems of resistance in French, which engaged his Catholic spirituality even as they celebrated his Senegalese heritage. That is one very unique thing about Senghor. You can find a very strong European heritage in his works, a Catholic French streak, very powerfully linked with his African background. We'll talk about that. His reaction or his attitude towards the concept of assimilation is something that we need to discuss. Yeah, and he was not just a poet, he was also, a person who edited major anthologies, thereby giving space for newer poets to express themselves. Many of the other African poets, you can think of writers like David Diop, for example. He considered Senghor as his mentor. So he edited anthologies of African works by African poets, especially in the French colonies. One of the major works is mentioned there, the 1945 work. It was very, very significant, mainly because it contained a very powerful introduction written by the existential philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre. Sartre was, of course, a big figure in the field of philosophy and letters at that point of time. And to get a person of Sartre's stature to write an introduction for this anthology tells us a great deal about his own stature. So, I mean, Sartre would not have written an introduction for any random person. It was an anthology that was edited by none other than Leopold Senghor. And this work, this anthology is significant, as I told you, not just for Sartre's essay in preface. It is in that he talks very philosophically about the relevance of negritude, of the negritude movement. That is one. Secondly, you have in this a kind of preface written by Senghor himself to this anthology. And that preface, again, very much like Wordsworth's preface to the lyrical ballads, in this case, this preface is preface written by Senghor is often recognized as the manifesto of the negritude movement. It's a brief preface, only about 5 stanzas or so, but it clearly enunciates the ideology of the negritude movement. Yeah, and along with that, that preface is just one among his non-fiction work that includes numerous volumes on poetry, on philosophy, politics, sociology, and African linguistics too. So you can think of him as a man of, as a very multidimensional kind of person. His stature is indeed very, very big. Yeah, as the first president of independent Senegal, as a major proponent of negritude, it was on a scholarship that he went to Paris, and there he studied at, again, this prestigious institution called the Lycée Louis-le-Grand, and then at the Sorbonne. The Sorbonne is, a major place. It's a place that we associate with the names of Nobel laureates in different fields, and he was privileged enough to be, qualified enough to be a student there. And it was there during these years that he spent in Paris that he got to see, the various movements or the various new experiments in painting and sculpture, music, and so on. You can think of this as the period of modernism. The great modernist wave had reached its peak, and you have the European writers, artists, sculptors, painters, musicians, architects, and so on, engaging in all kinds of experimental techniques, all kinds of new ways of expression. Avant-garde, we are so familiar with that phrase as associated with modernism. Make it new was their credo. And they were rewriting the conventional norms. Whatever upheld European writing and thinking and philosophy till then was kind of given up by these people, and they adopted new experimental avant-garde, very different kind of ways of expression. And observing these new ways of expression, Senghor, was quick to notice some parallels between these and his own impressions of African art, African culture, cultural forms, and so on. So there were many parallels. What these new modernists in Europe, in the different fields, were now coming up with, he discovered, were already part of African heritage in the kind of bodies that they painted, in the kind of masks that they engraved, in the kind of dances that they performed, in the kind of buildings that they had built, in the kind of life that they lived. That newness, that originality, which these new European writers and thinkers and artists were, conjuring at that point of time, it was already there. So therefore, he began to look at his own culture now in a different light, light altogether, because as a student there, he was naturally trained by the whites to downplay the importance of his African heritage. They never gave any credit at all for African heritage. It was considered as nil. Africa was always considered as the dark continent, and nobody would associate the word tradition, culture, and civilization and so on with Africa. They always considered Africa as the dark continent, peopled by barbarians who had to be civilized by the white people. That is what they took great pride in proclaiming as the white man's burden. So, he had been trained to look at African culture as barbarian. And it is now that he begins to look at it differently. He was naturally not the only person who began to think like that. He became associated with other students who also were under the same influence. We'll come to that slide soon. Anyway, he was very much active in France and in Senegal in the field of politics. He became the first president of Senegal when the country became independent in 1960. He continued till 1980, as I have already mentioned. And one important thing that one has to mention with regard to Senghor as a politician is that, unlike many of the other African countries where the transfer of power that happened after independence was often a very violent and unfriendly one. The colonies kind of maintained a very hostile relationship with their colonizers, as a result of which transfer of power was never a very smooth affair. The best and the most glaring example, of course, is the case of Nigeria, where soon after the British left, you have the civil war breaking out. It was not as if the Africans themselves were responsible for the civil war breaking out. It was nothing but the British system of administration which led to that kind of volatile situation which erupted in the Nigerian civil war, which is known as the Biafran War. If you have studied the work of people like John Pepper Clark, whose poem Casualties is all about that Biafran War and the effect that it had on Nigerians. Now, that is just to give you an instance of a country which had a very disturbed phase when it transferred power from the colonizer to itself. Whereas in Senegal, it was never rough or violent. It was Senghor who ensured the fact that the transfer of power was a very smooth one, and he had great respect for the French institutions, the French establishments, and the French way of governance and so on. He insisted that we should not give up on the French institutions. We should maintain very close, friendly ties with our colonizer even after our independence. Only then will we be able to come up and develop well enough. And he was indeed proven right. Senegal is, in fact, one of the very few countries where you do not have that kind of very disturbed civil war kind of situation prevailing much after independence. So that is to be attributed to Senghor and the very close relationship that he maintained with the French. And this can be also seen reflected in his poetry. As we have already mentioned, his politics cannot be divorced from his poetry. They both represent the same ethos. And he was also, in various ways affected by or influenced by socialist thinking, which was also on, riding a popular wave at that time in Europe. And he advocated a form of socialism that was based on African realities, and it was called African socialism. He did read Karl Marx, but he felt that Karl Marx's theories could not be directly applied to African countries, and that is why it had to be tweaked up a bit, and he called it African socialism. Anyway, he believed in this policy of equal representation and equal opportunities for all. That is why he is recognized as a major African socialist. Yeah, but apart from his politics, I think we need to now concentrate on Senghor as a poet, and before that, as a major proponent of negritude. Now, negritude is a word that I'm sure you have often heard discussed in literary discussions. It was basically a movement, a literary movement that was very powerful during the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. And it was particularly French in its tone and in its origin. This wave of negritude began among the French-speaking African and Caribbean writers who lived in Paris, who studied in Paris as students. And it was a kind of protest against the French colonial rule and the policy of assimilation. The French ruled their colonies in a way that propagated their theory of assimilation. That is, the colonies, or the people living in the colonies, ought to adopt French ways of life and culture and so on for their own good. That is what is known as assimilation. And it was against that policy of assimilation that some young men who were studying in different universities in France at that point of time launched their critique. And you have the leading figures. One, of course, is Leopold Senghor from Senegal. Another major theoretician, in fact, the one who coined the term negritude, was Aimé Césaire. He came from the neighboring country of Martinique in Western Africa. Senegal is, of course, one of the coastal countries, and very close to Senegal, you have the country of Martinique, which was also colonized by the French, Aimé Césaire. And then you have the third major theoretician, Leon Demas, who came from French Guiana, one of the countries outside Africa, which contributed to the negritude movement. Of course, French Guiana was also populated, like many other French colonies in French and English colonies in those regions, by the African people. They were taken there as slaves to work in the sugarcane plantations, sugarcane and cotton plantations. And therefore, French Guiana and the Caribbean islands, they were all peopled mainly by the Africans. So these three major, people, they got together, Senghor, Césaire, and Demas, and they were the ones who coined or who came up with this idea of negritude, a literary and artistic expression that prioritized Black African experience. They lived in a kind of situation, they lived in an era which negated African experience, which did not give any credit at all to African life or African experience. And here were people who conveyed the idea that the African experience is as human and as significant as white or European or any other kind of experience. And it needs to be written about. It needs to be celebrated. It needs to be projected through our artistic expressions. That is what negritude basically is. It is nothing but pride in their ancestry, a conviction in themselves, negritude, an assertion of their Negro identity, an assertion of their Black identity. Negra, the term comes from the Latin word negra, which means black. Okay, so Leopold Senghor, he defines negritude as the sum of the cultural values of the Black world as they are expressed in the life, the institutions, and the works of Black men. This is from that famous preface that I told you about. This is one way of looking at it. Each one of them has in fact written about negritude, defined negritude, the very fact of being Black. That is how Césaire, I think, defined negritude. They began to examine Western values critically and to reassess African culture. So they wanted to counter the Western stand regarding African culture. So it is a literary and ideological movement led by French-speaking Black writers and intellectuals from France's colonies in Africa and the Caribbean in the 1930s. It began in the 1930s. They were very much influenced by the Harlem Renaissance of the 1920s. The Harlem Renaissance is, of course, an American movement. It was in the city of New York, in the region of Harlem, that you have the emergence of this Black pride movement, pride in their Black identity. And these writers, after many of them, people like Langston Hughes, Claude McKay, these were some of the major figures of the Harlem Renaissance. When they traveled to Paris, that is when writers like Senghor, Demers, and Césaire happened to meet them and read their works. They were very much influenced by that, and they believed that we need to have that kind of a movement among the French, Francophone Black people too. So it rejected European colonization and its role in the African diaspora. They highlighted pride in their Blackness and traditional African values and culture. And they were also, in various ways, very much influenced by socialist or Marxist ideals. It was born from a shared experience of discrimination and oppression, and they wanted to counter, to destroy the stereotypes that prevailed among the white people about the blacks. If you are black, you are bad. That was a kind of stereotype. They had all kinds of stereotyped notions regarding the black people. അതിനെ എതിർക്കുക എന്നായിരുന്നു ഈ നെഗ്രിറ്റ്യൂഡിന്റെ ഒരു പ്രധാന ലക്ഷ്യം. And they wanted to create a new black consciousness. That is, the blacks can think, and there is a specific way that we think, that we live, that has to be celebrated in our works. We should not, like the blacks, look down upon the black way of life. That is what negritude upheld. As I told you, it was heavily influenced by the Harlem Renaissance of the 1920s, and Senghor himself considers Claude McKay as the spiritual founder of negritude. McKay, like Langston Hughes, where he was one of the founding fathers of the Harlem Renaissance, which was also an expression of black pride, a consciousness of a culture, and affirmation of a distinct identity. And the negritude movement followed in the same track. It was actually after the decline of the Harlem Renaissance that you have the new wave. So one of the first waves against the treatment of the blacks by the whites was the Harlem Renaissance. And the literary renaissance in the field of literature and art and culture, it was definitely the first wave. And then you have the next wave, that is the negritude movement. After the decline of the negritude movement, you go back to the United States, and there you have the black arts movement emerging from in the 1950s. Writers like what was his name? Leroy Jones or Barack. I'm getting the name Barack Obama. Leroy Jones, Amiri Baraka, and Ed Bullins. They were two major playwrights who contributed to the black arts movement. That was the next wave. Then, of course, you have the civil rights movement led by Martin Luther King soon after that. And now, of course, you have the Black Lives Matter movement, BLM. It continues. And in that continuing wave, the role played by the negritude movement is indeed very, very significant. We need to especially mention the journal that they founded, L'étudiant noir. I think I do not know how to pronounce it in French. Anyway, in French, it means the black student, L'étudiant noir, the black student. It, they began to work on this during the years 1934 and 35. Unfortunately, they could actually come out only with one issue of this journal, but that was enough. It really created a powerful impact. They did not have the finances to continue with this journal, but that one issue that came out was powerful enough. It was in this journal that Aimé Césaire wrote an article in which he first coined the term negritude. As I told you, it is derived from the Latin word niger, which means black. Yeah, this is in the background there, you have the journal, 1934. These are the three major figures. There were also a few women, who, as often happens, were sidelined and they were not given much significance. This is Aimé Césaire, who was the one who coined the term negritude in his poem, Cahier Durand, a notebook of a return to my native land. Yeah, it was in that poem that he came up with that term, negritude. And he defined negritude as the simple recognition of the fact that one is black. We need to recognize that, and we need to have pride in that blackness. That is what he meant by negritude. So the assertion of black pride by the members of the negritude movement was basically a cry against assimilation, because with the policy of assimilation, what the French government or the colonizer did, as the English and the other European colonizers did, was to convey the idea that the natives in the colonies ought to assimilate white values, white culture, white ways of life, and that they should be assimilated into that dominant culture. That would be their saving grace. That was what the policy of assimilation conveyed, and it was against that these people took a very strong stand. They believed that we don't need to be assimilated to the white culture. We will celebrate our own culture. Yeah, so I've just defined assimilation to the process whereby individuals or groups of differing ethnic heritage are absorbed into the dominant culture of a society. And this kind of forced assimilation was particularly dominant during the colonization, the period of colonization, and all the European colonial masters preached the theory of assimilation. Of course, later you have voluntary assimilation also. In certain parts, they take up, voluntary assimilation. For example, in New Zealand, the white people there, in Canada, they did not live like, even though they asserted their New Zealand or Canadian identity, they appropriated the white ways of life. They lived, their culture was very much that of the Europeans. So that is not forced, that is voluntary assimilation. But here we are talking about forced assimilation. Yeah, so Amy Cizer's declaration at a very important conference in Geneva in the year 1978, that's also a very powerful way of looking at negritude. He said, when it appeared, the literature of negritude created a revolution. In the darkness of the great silence, a voice was rising up with no interpreter, no alteration, and no complacency, a violent and staccato voice, and it said for the first time, I negre, that is, I am black. A voice of revolt, a voice of resentment, no doubt, but also of fidelity, honesty towards themselves, their own culture, of fidelity, truthfulness towards themselves. Also fidelity, a voice of freedom, and first and foremost, a voice for the retrieved identity, the identity that they retrieved. We'll just mention the third major figure of the negritude movement, that is Leon Damas. He, in his anthology, Pigments, it's a major anthology. His collection, Pigments, is also referred sometimes by many critics as a manifesto of the movement. In each one of these poems, you have him arguing against slavery, segregation, colonial assimilation, and so on. But now I think we will focus on Senghor and this anthology, the image of which you see there, anthology of black poetry. It is in this, with that very famous introduction given by Jean-Paul Sartre and the preface written to it by Senghor himself. This, 1948 anthology is often considered a manifesto of the negritude movement. The preface or the introduction was written by, the preface was written by Sartre, the introduction was written by Senghor. And, what Sartre said about this, that is how negritude gained so much of respect, that the great existential philosopher who has contributed great works like Being and Nothingness and the Myth of Sisyphus, and so, I'm sorry, Sartre, that Myth of Sisyphus is Camus' work. Sartre, of course, Being and Nothingness is his major work. He's one of the important philosophers of the 20th century. The fact that he had written about it gave a lot of attention the world over to negritude. People took note of it. And he titled that preface, Black Orpheus. Orpheus is, of course, a figure from Greek mythology, a poet, and he calls negritude, the negritude writers, as the Black Orpheus. And the power of poetry, that is something that cannot be denied. But at the same time, poetry is ultimately poetry. It is not something that can have a very powerful impact on life as it is really lived, is probably the idea that it was conveyed. So he, in a way, he uh, succeeded in gaining for the negritude movement a great deal of attention. At the same time, this preface also highlighted the weak points of the negritude movement, that after all, it was only a poetic movement. And in a way, it was actually a kind of anti-racist racism. In other words, it is fighting against racism. It is something that takes a very powerful stand against racism. But in highlighting the importance of African races, they were actually being racist. An anti-racist person should actually say that racism should be wiped away, that we should not have any distinction made between people who belong to different races. But here, even when they were taking that kind of an anti-racist stand, അവരെന്താണ് ചെയ്യുന്നത്? അവർ വീണ്ടും ആ റേസിനെ ഒരു യാർഡ് സ്റ്റിക്ക് ആയിട്ട് ഉപയോഗിക്കുകയാണ്. ബിക്കോസ് they're talking about the importance of African races and that Africa has its own culture. അവരുടെ ആ റേസിന്റെ കൾച്ചറിനെ വൈപ്പ് അവേ ചെയ്യാൻ പാടില്ല. Again, giving a lot of importance to racism there. That is why he called it an anti-racist racism. And therefore, which is why later critics often consider this preface written by Sartre to be a kind of kiss of death given by the existential philosopher to the movement. It was a kiss, but at the same time, it was a kiss of death. In other words, it pinpointed the weakness of the negritude movement, which, it goes without saying. In about 20 or 25 years, this movement also became rather weak. It died down. In fact, one of the major writers of Africa, Wole Soyinka, he is actually the first African writer to be awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature. What did he have to say about the negritude movement? He did not have any regard or great respect for the negritude movement. In fact, he believed that the negritude movement is something that actually continues to colonize the Black person. The Black person is placing himself or herself in a rather negative or in a secondary position by further upholding the concept of negritude. And he says, it's a very famous statement that he made regarding negritude. A tiger does not announce its tigritude. It merely pounces. And that is how he made fun of the negritude writers. They are highlighting their own Blackness and thereby giving themselves a rather inferior position in the scheme of things. Yeah, so what Sartre said about the negritude movement is mentioned there. Yeah, before we begin the poem, and you can't discuss the poem without talking about negritude. That is why I'll just highlight some of the chief concerns of negritude. They were, as I told you, of course, strongly against the policy of assimilation upheld by the Europeans. Then they were also very much upset and disturbed by the way the Blacks were treated during the World Wars. The Blacks had no say at all. They were forced as members of colonies of the British and the French. They had to participate in the World Wars. Nobody asked them, nobody requested them to be members of the army, the Imperial Army. They were not given no choice at all, but were forced and compelled to participate in the war. And they were forced to fight a war, the cause of which was not theirs. They were not fighting for themselves. They were fighting for the white masters. And even when they were fighting for the white masters, the treatment that they received on the battlefield was terrible. They were always treated as inferiors, and many were the soldiers who were the butt of racist ridicule at the hands of their fellow soldiers. And therefore, they became increasingly aware They began to study history, they began to study other philosophical works and so on, and they became very strongly aware of the humiliation of Black people throughout history, first under slavery and then under colonial rule. So they wanted to protest against all that, and therefore they wanted to highlight the value and the dignity of African traditions and African people. They also wanted to highlight a major difference between the African way of life and the European way of life. The African way of life, being closer to nature, is warmer, it is more emotional, it is more, it is something that gives greater attention to nature, to ancestors, and the soul, and so on. Whereas Western culture, they constantly underlined, was very materialistic. It was something that gave too much importance to acquiring things, to wealth, to material possessions. Even nature is something that the Westerner or the white man sees as something that he can own, something that he can possess. That kind of materialism is something that the Africans totally disagreed with, and therefore they considered the Western culture as one that is soulless, whereas the African culture is always in contact with the universal soul. It is closer to nature, it is warmer, it is more emotional, unlike the Western culture, which is materialistic and also too much based on reason. Everything is reasoned there. You do not imagine, you do not think, you do not feel the way the Africans think. And therefore, when the Africans write, when they engage in art, it must not be to European models that they should look up. They should look back to their own cultural heritage and derive their values from there. And that, according to them, is something that the modern world also would greatly benefit from. The world as it is now is something that has been very seriously badly affected by the materialistic and soulless culture of the Westerners, white Westerners. Now it should be healed. Those wounds can be healed by going back to the African way of life. And that is something that we can revive by expressing it through our works. So that was their stand. They were all politically committed, and they insisted upon the fact that African writers should use African subject matter, African poetic traditions, their own rhythms, their own techniques, and so on. Their work should always uphold that desire for political freedom. And it encompasses the whole of African cultural, economic, social, and political values. As I told you, after the 1960s, the movement went into a kind of decline. It was very much criticized by people like Wole Soyinka also. I've already mentioned that. Yeah, now focusing on Senghor himself, he, again, it was rather different from the other negritude writers like Demas and Césaire. Both of them were tooth and nail against assimilation. But as a politician, Senghor had a different take on assimilation. He was not, so totally against the concept of assimilation. In other words, he believed that the people of Senegal, the Black people in general, have actually much to learn from the white establishments, especially with regard to governance, especially with regard to education and so on. There is much that we can benefit from our association with the white people. So he propounded a kind of cultural miscegenation, that is a mixture of black and white. And in most of his works, you find this harmony, between the black and the white as something that he upholds, something that he celebrates, something that he expresses the need for, that mixture, that harmony. As a typical poem, New York, I think, is one that totally represents that policy of miscegenation or mixture of black and white. So he also, so on the one hand, he promoted a rediscovery and a celebration of African beliefs and values, the establishment of an authentic African black self. But At the same time, he also imagined a new racial consciousness in which a dual black and white cultural background could work towards a place or a space of mutual enlightenment. There is much that we can give and take. The white man can learn from us, the black man can learn from the white man too. In some of the works of uh, Langston Hughes, for example, you have Theme for English B, a major poem by Langston Hughes. It is pretty much the same idea that he too expresses. So that theme of harmony is something that you do not find so much in Demas and Césaire, but in Senghor, you definitely have that. So, yeah, he was aware of the fact that the African ontology, African, way of looking at life is opposed to traditional way of looking at life. And the European one is rather static. It is too much based on reason. Therefore, it is objective and it is dualistic, with distinction drawn between body and soul, matter and spirit. Whereas in the African ontology, African way of life, matter and spirit are one. Body and spirit are one. It is monotheistic. It is monologic. It is not dualistic. It is monologic, monotheistic also to that extent. And so no, one wouldn't use the word monotheistic, but it is not dualistic. I would call it that way. Yeah, and the African world, it is mobile yet with a unique reality which emphasizes the importance of the spirit. Yeah, so he distinguished between the Negro African knowledge and European knowledge, and both can give and take to each other. Negro African knowledge is knowledge by confrontation and intuition, while European knowledge is knowledge that is gained by analysis and reason. They always reason, whereas the Africans feel and conclude things very intuitively. That is how they look at life. That is how they make decisions and so on. And this distinction is between, one between disinterested objectivity. European way of life is very, very objective, whereas the African way of life is one of sympathetic understanding. It is very much involved. It is very much a very, one which involves everyone together. So it's a kind of new method. And the new European modernists, whether it is in the field of science, the theory of relativity of Einstein, for example, or the quantum theory, or the various new experiments in painting, in cubism, for example, in surrealism, in all of these, actually, you find not the projection of reason, but the projection of intuition. Those writers, those artists, those scientists were actually protesting against the overabundance of reason in their analyses, in their way of looking at life. So that is how he could see this very close relationship between the traditional African way of life and culture and the new modernist ways. So these various revolutions have changed our outlook on reality and how best to approach it. Reality now, to the Europeans at that point of time, appears as discontinuous and undetermined, forcing even the European to change the idea of objectivity and visual realism. And that is what the Africans have always been upholding. With that background, I think we can do the poem New York today. I'll just take, I think, 20 minutes, so we should be able to finish it today. It's one of his well-known poems from the collection Ethiopiques, and he dedicates it to jazz orchestra with a solo trumpet. Throughout the poem, you find a lot of reference to music and, the jazz orchestra. Jazz is something which has in it a beautiful coming together of the black and white culture. It has as its basis the black rhythm, but it is also very much performed by the Western or the white people too. And that is why he considers jazz orchestra as something which symbolizes the kind of harmony that he upholds in his poem, which is why he dedicates this poem about New York to jazz orchestra. The richness of jazz orchestra is something that he salutes there, just as he salutes the spirit of New York. And now New York is a city unlike any other. It is in New York that you have the origin of the Harlem Renaissance. And New York brings to you the best of this miscegenation or this mixture of black and white. So that is why he celebrates New York. Of all the cities, it is to New York that he pays this tribute. It begins, of course, with the arrival of a person like him in New York, an outsider, somebody who finds New York dazzling, strange, and totally fascinating. The first part, of this, you can call it a kind of ode, is all about the fascination that he feels in this strange city. New York, he addresses the city of New York. At first, I was bewildered by your beauty. He has never seen anything quite like New York, with its tall buildings and the people dressed so differently. Those huge, long-legged golden girls, the blonde women there who are, seen so prominently dressed in such a very fashionable, very trendy manner with their long stockings and so on. He's never seen the like of these in any other part of the world, the least of all in his African villages. So shy at first. So the stranger who arrives in New York is initially extremely shy before your blue metallic eyes and icy smile. He's talking about the general impression that he gets of New York. There is something very cold and very harsh, something very icy, that the metallic blue eyes, not only in the people, the blue eyes of the people, that is something strange. The city itself seems to have a blue metallic nature about it, probably talking about the facade of the buildings and the skyscrapers, and full of despair at the end of skyscraper streets. He feels extremely lonely probably in this place, despair, helpless and full of despair. Raising my owl eyes at the eclipse of the sun. When the sun sets, he raises his owl eyes. Your light is sulphurous against the pale towers whose heads strike lightning into the sky. It's almost as if the buildings go right up to the sky, and it is as if the buildings cause lightning in the sky. And skyscrapers defying storms with their steel shoulders. It seems as if nature itself is stopped by these buildings. Even the worst storm would be prevented or stopped by these buildings. Their steel shoulders and weathered skin of stone. He's talking about that typical landscape of the city of New York, the cityscape of New York, with its tall buildings, the stone high rises, the metallic facades, the glass exteriors, everything. There's something very, very different from the landscape that he is familiar with in other parts of the world, particularly in Africa. So after that initial sense of great fascination, then suddenly you have him feeling extremely homesick. But 2 weeks on the naked sidewalks of Manhattan, he feels extremely exposed, naked sidewalks of Manhattan. He feels very, very vulnerable in the city of New York. Manhattan is one of the regions there. And at the end of the 3rd week, the fever overtakes you with a jaguar sleep. He is very strongly affected by fever, and he compares that to something that he is more familiar with. The jaguar is an African animal, and almost as if a jaguar has leapt on you, you are down with fever. 2 weeks without well water. The well water is standing for all that his tradition symbolizes. Whereas here you get tap water or bottled water. That whole difference between water that is manufactured and water that is free flowing. You can contrast the African way of life and the American way of life, or the white way of life. 2 weeks without well water or pasture all birds of the air fall suddenly dead under the high, sooty terraces. I can't see water there, water flowing freely. I can't see well water. I can't see green pastures. It seems as if all the birds of the air fall down dead under the dark terraces. You have the dark, the slate roofs probably of some buildings, and it seems it's as if all the birds fall down dead. In other words, he does not see the birds flying as he sees in his villages. No laugh from a growing child, his hand in my cool hand. He misses the human touch of children, touch of babies, that rawness, that innocence, something that he misses totally. No mother's breast, but nylon legs. He does not see the very warm images of mothers nursing their children or feeding their babies. But here you have women strutting about in nylon legs. You have these long stockings made of nylon. The word nylon itself, nylon is a material, as you are familiar. It's a polymer. The name nylon itself is actually a combination of New York, NY, and London, LON. And it stands for something that is artificial, something that is made up. New York and London, the industries of New York and London coming up to create this artificial material it's a synthetic material. It is not a natural fiber. It is a synthetic material, and that is what he sees everything. So he talks about the artificiality, the synthetic nature of everything in America, and he misses the warm, natural scenes of Africa. Legs and breasts without smell or sweat. Plenty of legs and breasts are seen everywhere, but they lack the warmth of what he sees in Africa. No tender word and no lips, only artificial hearts paid for in cold cash. The very material, money-minded nature of life is what he encounters there, and therefore he misses the African way of life where, there's so much of warmth in the dealings and not one book offering wisdom. He's talking about the wisdom, the folk wisdom, which has its own place in the African way of life. So much of importance given to ancestors, to the village elders, and so on. That kind of system does not prevail in the city of New York. And the painter's palette yields only coral crystals. He uses a very powerful image to convey this idea of that, the very stony-heartedness, the very cold stony-heartedness that he experiences there. It's almost as if a painter tries to paint something, he does not get paint, but coral crystals. In the palette, painter's palette, instead of the wet, flowing paint, you only have hard crystals of coral, with which you just cannot paint anything. As a result of which he feels extremely sleepless nights, odd nights of Manhattan. In the city of New York, he only has sleepless nights, stirring with delusions while car horns blare the empty hours. And in that state of sleeplessness is further augmented by the car horns that are honking away late into the night. The city of New York is one that hardly sleeps. It's a 24/7 kind of city. And here you have the murky streams carrying away hygienic, loving, like rivers overflowing with the corpses of babies. It's not as if there is no water there. New York is, of course, situated on the banks of Hudson Bay, but it is a very murky, muddy kind of stream, and anything that is hygienic, anything that is loving seems to have been washed away, almost as if you would be watching the corpses of babies, like rivers overflowing with corpses of babies. That is the worst form of water that he can think of. And that is what he feels when he looks at the water body surrounding the city of New York. In other words, he misses his home and he feels extremely alienated in this land. But then he comes to that region of New York where he finds a new kind of life. And where is that? That is nothing but Harlem. Harlem, as you all know, is the part of New York where the blacks reside. And it is there that you have the flowering of African culture and African tradition. the Black Renaissance takes place in Harlem, and his encounter with the white culture and the way the introduction to the Harlem poets like Langston Hughes and Claudia McKay changed his outlook on life. That is what you have here. Now is a time of signs and reckoning. So the second section of the poem takes you to a region altogether. He does not name the region immediately, but when you look at the different objects, images that are written about here, you know that it is a different region of New York. It is not the region that is described in the first section. It is that region which is peopled by the Black people. Now is a time of signs and reckoning, New York, and he reaches an area where where he reckons with New York in a different way. Now is a time of manna and hyssop. Manna and hyssop. Manna is, of course, both of these are biblical references. I've put up a picture of the hyssop there. It's a spicy, aromatic herb which is referred to in the Bible. Manna again is food from something God sent, something that is given as a blessing by the gods. And his encounter with Harlem was like that. It was a turning point for him. It was almost being given manna by the gods, and it was as fragrant, as beautiful a moment as one that was blessed by hyssop, as mentioned in the Bible. And you just have to listen to the trombones. It's almost as if God is playing on the trombones. The trombone is that musical instrument, the picture of which you find there on the slide, and one that you often find the Black people playing. It's a kind of evolution of some of the African musical instruments. You have a lot of wind instruments among the Africans, and then when the Blacks settled down in New York, in America, they began to manufacture instruments like these, which were metallic versions of their original folk instruments. So listen to the trombones that you can hear played in Harlem, and it's almost as if God himself is playing. Listen to God's trombones, to your heart beating to the rhythm of blood, your blood, and his heart now is pumping up. It's beating loudly with excitement, with joy, with greatness, and he can feel the pulse of his blood beating in the rhythm that he hears played out there in Harlem. I saw Harlem teeming with sounds and ritual colors and outrageous smells. All the smells and sounds and sights that he is familiar with, he encounters in Harlem. It's a kind of, celebration of all the senses, the sights, the sounds, the smells, the tastes. At tea time in the home of the drugstore delivery man. Yeah, he talks about the Black people like him, people who would only be employed as the drugstore delivery man. They are the Blacks there, and they are not the kind of people who would be employed in any elite positions. They would be doing odd jobs, sundry jobs like that of a delivery man and so on. That would be the typical kind of job that would be that these Black people would be employed for at tea time. And it is when they have their break during tea that you have Harlem coming out into its own, and Harlem pulsating with life. At tea time, in the home of the drugstore delivery man, I saw the festival of night begin at the retreat of day. During the daytime, they are busy with their work. They have to work for their white masters. But at the end of day, that is when they come out onto the streets. They cook their food out there. They dance their dances. They play their music. They sing their songs. It is a jubilant evening every day. I saw the festival of night begin at the retreat of day, and I proclaim night more truthful than the day. This is Harlem. This is authentic Black culture. And that is why the night is more truthful than the day. It is a pure hour when God brings forth life immemorial in the streets. It's an hour that is blessed by God when they celebrate themselves all the amphibious elements shining like suns. He calls them amphibians. We know, we're familiar with amphibians that can live both on land and on water. Similarly, the blacks, during the daytime, they are the smug, submissive servants of the white people, but during the night, they come out in their elements and they dance and sing and do everything that they want. They are the amphibious elements. And everywhere around you find these amphibious elements shining like suns. During the night, the suns come out because they are in their amphibious, in their elements. And he just cannot contain the excitement. Harlem, Harlem, now I've seen Harlem, in great excitement. He calls out, this is home for him. A green breeze of corn rising from the pavements. In this whole section, you find a very surreal depiction of all that he sees there in Harlem. The masks, the feathers, it's almost as if he finds a reenactment of an African village scene on the streets of Harlem. It's very surreal, a coming together of all kinds of sights, sounds, dreams. It's a very, very dreamy landscape that he paints for us. This is the richness of African life in New York. A green breeze of corn rising from the pavements. There on those stone pavements, I can see the cornfields and the breeze gently swaying the corn leaves, plowed by the dancers' bare feet. And I can almost visualize them dancing there, the dancers' bare feet. The Dan is, I think, one of the tribes of Africa. And here in Harlem, I can see the bare feet of those African dancers. Hips rippling like silk and spearhead breasts. You have that image of the African dancers. You have them decorated with all kinds of paint and feathers and animal things, and then you would have the spear and all that. All of that, you find here. Hips rippling like silk and spearhead breasts, ballets of water lilies and fabulous masks. All those different elements of African life and culture, he finds depicted here. And mangoes of love rolling from the low houses. He feels almost as if the houses, African houses, have been erected here on the pavements of New York. And mangoes of love. Yeah, mangoes, again, something that you would associate more with Africa than with America. Mangoes of love, not apples of love, but mangoes of love rolling from the low houses to the feet of the police horses. And the policemen, they would not be on horses, but he imagines that you have the African landscape, the horses from Africa also galloping along, trotting along these streets. And along sidewalks, I saw streams of white rum and streams of black milk in the blue haze of cigars. As these black people relax and have their drink and smoke their cigars, you can find milk overflowing, black milk overflowing. It's almost like, that proverbial land of milk and honey, of black milk. And at night, I saw cotton flowers snow down. One can almost see snow coming down. And what is it that is snowing down? The cotton flowers. The cotton is, the plantations where the blacks were made to work. And, in that beautiful, surreal, dream-like sequence, you find the cotton flowers coming down like snow. All in all, it's a very fascinating picture. Just try to visualize this. All that he brings in, celebrating the way the people of Harlem celebrate themselves. At night, I saw cotton flowers snow down from the sky and the angels' wings and sorcerers' plumes. It was all very magical. It's almost as if you have a sorcerer, a magician with his plumes, with his feathers, creating magic here. And you can find angelic wings spread all around. In other words, it was such a beautiful sight and such a beautiful experience that he encountered in Harlem. Listen, New York. And therefore, this richness, this brilliance, this vibrant celebration is something that New York, he says, should listen to. Listen, New York. He's asking New York to listen to this. Oh, listen to your bass male voice, your vibrant oboe voice. The oboe is, again, this instrument, that choral kind of instrument, again, of African ancestry. Listen to the rich African music, the bass male voice, the oboe being played, the muted anguish of your tears falling in great clots of blood. He's reminded of the great clots of blood, the very harsh and painful years of slavery, which must have given the blacks some very bloody moments of pain. But they have overcome all that. And therefore, this story of survival, this story of overcoming all odds, is something that New York should definitely listen to and learn something from. Listen to the distant beating of your nocturnal heart. Listen to the heartbeat of these dancers, of these black people, and you can hear your own nocturnal heart, reminding them that after all, we are all the same human beings who live on this earth. And the heart that beats in them is very much the heart that beats in you too. If you listen to their heartbeat, you can actually hear your own distant heartbeats. That essential unity of all is what he talks about. And if you can hear that, then you would be able to celebrate and gain much from that harmony. The tom tom's rhythm and blood, tom tom blood and tom tom. Tom tom, of course, refers to the African drums, a very integral way of life in Africa. That is how they would communicate their messages to from one village to the other. They would tom tom the messages on these drums. And now he's telling the people of New York, the white people of New York, listen to this, gain something from this. The tom tom, which is so rhythmic and so pulsating with life, is something that can teach you a big lesson about endurance, about living life in the best possible manner. So he's exhorting the white people to learn something about the African way of life. And the last stanza, in the last section, here he says, New York, I say New York, let black blood flow into your blood. Let it wash the rust from your steel joints like an oil of life. This black blood, if you can embrace that black blood, if you can embrace the black people as your brethren, then all the rust that is there in your cities will be gone. It will be washed away. A thurumbu muzhuvan illadavum if you embrace the white people, the black people as your brethren. It will be the oil of life that can give much richness to you and your life. Let it give your bridges the curve of hips and supple vines. New York is a city that has many bridges proclaiming its development, its great growth, its industrial nature, its stature, its wealth, and so on. We have the poet Hart Crane, who has written about Brooklyn Bridge, one of the important landmarks of New York. But those bridges are just mechanical bridges. If they should have the element of life in them, they should involve the black people too, because the black people were the ones who worked to construct these bridges. Give your bridges the curve of hips and the supple vines. In some translations, this is of course a translation, some of the words may be different in various translations. In some translations, I have seen the supple liana. Instead of that, you have the word vines here. Liana is nothing but the strong vine, hanging from trees, which you find in these African jungles, the kind of vines on which a character like Tarzan, for example, would swing from one tree to another. And your bridges should have that nature, the strength of nature, the curve of hips and the supple vines. Now the ancient age returns, unity is restored. And when the black and the white come together, when the white embraces the black as brethren, then you would have unity restored. The reconciliation of the lion and the bull and the tree. It's a beautiful image of harmony that you have there. The lion, of course, standing for Africa and the animals of the African grasslands, the lion being the most important among those. You have the bull, probably a reference to the New York Stock Exchange, which has as its statue this bull, the raging bull, you know, in stock exchange, you have the bulls and the bears. The bulls are the buyers. And in accordance with that, right in front of that financial capital of America, in front of the New York Stock Exchange, you have this statue, this brass statue of a bull. And it's probably a reference to that. All the materialistic ways of life of the Americans, the lion, the African natural way of life, the bull, the materialistic American way of life, coming together, and the tree there standing as a symbol of that natural harmony. Idea links to action, the ear to the heart, sign to meaning. And you can gain much ideas and attach much sign to this coming together. When you do that, when you have that kind of harmony, you can see your rivers stirring with musk alligators. The rivers of America will start, pulsating with life of the musk alligators. Alligator, it's a kind of alligator, and the sea cows with mirage eyes. The sea cow refers to an animal called the manatee. These are all natives of the rivers in and around America, particularly in the Mississippi and so on. And you can find, a new life coming to America when the blacks and the whites come together. And then you would not need to invent any more new sirens. Sirens, in some you would find mermaids, siren, mermaid, whatever. These are all creatures from fairy tales. In other words, what he's trying to say is, you don't need any more fairy tales. You can have a beautiful fairy tale in the coming together of the blacks and the whites. You don't need anything more magical. You don't need anything more fairy tale like than this beautiful harmony. Just open your eyes to the April rainbow. And when this harmony takes place, when this coming together takes place, you can see a rainbow. Rainbow is always used in the Western context as a covenant, as a symbol of a coming together, a signing, when something is, what shall you say, agreed upon, you have this, the rainbow there appearing as a sign, as an omen. And here, when the blacks and the whites come together, you can see a beautiful April rainbow. Why April rainbow? Because it refers to the rain, the spring rain. When the rain comes in spring, it has a beauty all its own. And that is when you would find this rainbow symbolizing the coming together of the blacks and the whites. And your eyes, especially your ears, to God, just listen to God. Just watch out for that God. And he ends the poem now with one beautiful image of a God. What kind of God? A new kind of God. It's a God that is different from God as is popularized by Western ways of thinking. Listen to this God who, in one burst of saxophone laughter, you have a very human image of a God here. God is not somebody who lords over you. God is a very human kind of God. The Africans, have a very, very close relationship with their deities or their gods. They worship the rocks, they worship the trees, they worship the leaves. It is in nature that they find their gods. They worship nature. And similarly, the whites can now see a new God who, in one burst of saxophone laughter, here is a God who laughs aloud and plays the saxophone, this musical instrument, which is again very much associated with black musicians. And you can find God very jubilantly playing on that saxophone and laughing loudly, a very happy, joyous, very warm kind of God who created heaven and earth in 6 days. Okay, we will follow the biblical story of the creation, and then God said, let there be light, and there was light, and so on, and so on. Okay, we will accept that. The blacks will accept that story of creation, but let us end it with one Negro twist. And what is that? On the seventh day, we will believe that God slept a deep Negro sleep. Here, instead of the Sabbath day on which God takes rest according to the white man's Bible, here he says, let us imagine God taking rest. And he's not taking rest in a very normal manner. He's sleeping a deep Negro sleep and probably snoring away. It's that kind of a new imagery, a new cultural imagery that would be made possible if you have the coming together of the blacks and the whites. You have the best of the white and the best of the black culture coming together, and you would be left with a very warm, pulsating, lively image of a God who would make your world a very happy, joyous, and musical one. So you can hear the loud echo of the saxophone, God laughing, and God sleeping away a long, deep Negro sleep. So that is the poem, New York. It is in the city of New York that he sees the possibility of that kind of harmony of the blacks and the whites coming together, which would ensure beauty all around. I would just conclude with a famous statement made by a major critic who's worked on the poetry of Senghor, Sylvia Washington Burr, in her famous work known as the title, The Concept of Negritude in the Poetry of Leopold Sédar Senghor. She says, Senghor was among the first to give poetic expression to African experience in a European tongue, and in so doing has achieved a synthesis of inspiration and means of expression that does honor to both and betrays neither. So it does honor to both the best of the white and the best of the black culture. It betrays neither. As Senghor himself said, I sing to you the song of darkness with a new voice, with the ancient voice of the world's youth. So that note of harmony is something that will enable you to understand the poem New York better. Just read it. It's a very visual poem. I would say a very, very sensual poem, sensuous poem. One that, evokes all the senses, the sounds, the sights, the tastes, the fragrances, everything. And you need to visualize the whole thing to see the richness that Senghor talks about. That is the dream that he had of coming together, of the harmony of black and white. Okay, so he, believed that negritude is something that can make the world a better place. The white people can definitely learn much from the blacks. That is how he propagated negritude. And I think we can see the best of that in this poem, New York. Okay, it's been a long session. Please read the poem yourself. Are you all here?
Yes, ma'am.
Recording.
Ma'am.
Thank you for your patient listening. I'll stop the recording now.